This week on Business Brief, a look at how proposed state budget cuts to humanities funding would impact historical societies. Then, a conversation about the use of crop insurance to mitigate risk in farming. Welcome to Business Brief, Missouri Business Alert's podcast focused on the business news and issues shaping the state. My name is Noah Grabianski, and I am joined by my co-host, Trevor Grandin. Trevor, how are you this week?
I'm doing pretty good now that it's finally spring.
Yeah, I think spring is finally springing. And we have a full show today, so let's get right into these headlines. Gas prices have spiked over 20% across the nation since the United States attacked Iran nearly 2 weeks ago. That's led to an average increase of close to 70 cents per gallon at the pump in Missouri. Since the start of the war, Missouri gas prices have jumped from around $2.50 per gallon to nearly $3.20 as of Thursday, according to Gas Buddy. As of Thursday afternoon, the price per barrel of crude oil stands at just over $90. The domestic benchmark has been anywhere from $67 to $95 per barrel.
Consumer prices increased by 2.4% in February from a year earlier. That matched the annual rate of inflation in January. Although gas and energy prices were relatively steady in February, experts are expecting an increase due to the conflict in Iran. The indexes for food at home and food away from home saw increases along with beef and veal prices, and the price of lettuce accounted for the highest change in produce prices since February.
A plan to overhaul funding for higher education in Missouri is still alive after a narrow House Budget Committee vote on Wednesday and bipartisan criticism. The plan would shift a quarter of state funding for four-year programs and 14% of state funding for two-year programs. This rearrangement would result in Missouri's two historically black universities, as well as Truman State, to lose 35% or more of their state funding, while others would receive about 26% more. Lawmakers have warned that the plan would force some smaller colleges to close, while supporters of the proposal say that it would force colleges and universities to justify their state funding and incentivize an agreement on a future funding formula.
An approval to expand the state sales tax and eliminate the income tax won initial approval in the State House this week. Income tax generates about 2/3 of annual state revenue. To make up the revenue in sales tax without expanding taxable transactions, lawmakers would need to raise the state sales tax to nearly 13%. Current sales tax for general revenue is 3%, though total sales tax is about 8 to 11%, depending on location. Democrats have claimed the Republican bill would lead to massive cuts to public schools and would shift the tax burden to the poor. Supporters of the bill say that recent cuts to income, corporate, franchise, and capital gains taxes prove the plan could work. The bill needs one more vote in the State House before it heads to the Senate.
A new report has given Missouri a failing grade in its March report card, ranking the state among the worst in the country in protecting sports gamblers. Main reasons for the grade include a lack of addiction and bankruptcy protections and loss limits, according to the report by the Center for Addiction Science, Policy, and Research. The only states in the report to earn passing grades were those that haven't yet legalized online sports gambling, while the 38 states that have all received D's or F's. Missouri tied with Kansas for 36th.
And 2 Missouri amusement parks are being sold to a Kansas City-based real estate investment trust. Six Flags St. Louis and Worlds of Fun in Kansas City are 2 of 7 assets being sold to EPR Properties. EPR has promised new attractions, better values, and a rebrand for the St. Louis property. The firm is expected to take over around the end of March or beginning of April. We'll be right back with Business Brief after a word from our sponsor.
Are you ready to be inspired and empowered? Since 2023, That's What She Said Columbia has provided a platform for local women's voices, strengthening our community through the power of storytelling. On Saturday, April 11th at 7 p.m. at the Missouri Theater, the 4th annual That's What She Said Columbia will feature the intimate, powerful stories of 9 women from our community. 25% of the ticket sales will go to the Voluntary Action Center to provide essential hygiene products for women in need. Find us at columbia.shesaidproject.com and purchase your tickets now.
Our first story is about an ongoing funding conversation here in Missouri, and one of the many sectors that could be affected by it. But I don't need to say too much about it because this is a story from you, right, Trevor?
It is. So this story came about from a childhood memory I have.
Okay.
Growing up, I lived down the street from a local history museum. And looking back, I kind of always wondered what it takes to run a museum.
That's crazy because I also grew up basically down the street from my town's historical museum. But I sense there's a twist to this story.
There is. That ongoing conversation you mentioned is the state budget for the next fiscal year. It's still being debated in Jefferson City, but its original draft cut millions from humanities funding. I talked with some experts to see what that means for how historical societies are funded. Here's the story. Over 200 years of history stand at attention in the Adair County Historical Society in Kirksville, Missouri. Battlefield dioramas and farming equipment, filing cabinets filled with almost every last name that's ever lived in the county. A horse and buggy sans the horse. And upstairs, an old balsa wood clock face that used to hang above the county courthouse.
The birds used to land on it and it changed the time all the time, so you could never trust the time.
That's Blytha Ellis, and she's been president of the Adair County Historical Society for 10 years. Since she took over in 2016, the Society's membership has more than doubled. That means more revenue for an organization staffed completely by volunteers.
2 workers on Wednesday that volunteer, and Thursday, and then me on Friday.
This is the reality for many of the almost 250 local historical organizations throughout Missouri. A dedicated crew of volunteers who operate on a revenue of programming grants and donations from local residents. A reality that could get harder. In his budget proposal for next year, Governor Mike Kehoe suggested a $600 million cut from the current budget. Included in that cut is an almost 50% funding reduction to the Missouri Humanities Council's spending authority. This trust acts as a pass-through for organizations across the state, like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, the Griot Museum of Black History, and Missouri Humanities. Ashley Beard-Fosnow, former executive director of the Missouri Humanities, spoke at a Missouri House Budget Committee meeting in January. She said a 50% transfer cut could mean fewer staff, programs, and regrants.
Which would have a negative impact on the state, especially ahead of this semi-quincentennial year when we're getting ready to showcase to the world Missouri's culture and history and heritage.
This all comes at a precarious time for arts and culture funding nationwide. According to the Federation of State Humanities Councils, less than 50% of appropriated funding made it into the bank accounts of humanities councils last year. This year, the U.S. Senate gave the National Endowment for the Humanities $207 million in a January appropriations bill, but organizations are still reeling from last year's funding interruptions. John Garrison Marks is the Vice President for Research and Engagement at the American Association of State and Local History. He says that funding is a perennial issue for historical organizations.
And so you have institutions that end up on this never-ending sort of hamster wheel, inventing new projects so that they can get grant funding, and what they actually need is general operating support.
Back in Adair County, Blytha Ellis is confident that the Historical Society can keep going, even with fewer grants. Much of their revenue comes from memberships and donations. Members receive a yearly calendar and a quarterly magazine filled with stories of orphan trains, abandoned ski resorts, and notable residents of Adair County. This diversified offering, rooted in local support, has also worked well for the Boone County History and Culture Center. Chris Campbell is the center's executive director and said almost 40% of last year's revenue came from donations made independent from fundraising events and memberships.
Thanks to our support from our members and donors, we're pretty insulated from the type of cuts that I think we're going to see in the humanities and the arts at the state level.
Because the center functions as both a history museum and an art gallery, they receive grants from another organization that could also see steep cuts next year, the Missouri Arts Council. Campbell says these grants make up less than 5% of the center's budget and that they'll continue to provide programs either way. Programs for the close to 1,500 fifth-grade students that take a 2-hour field trip to the center each fall. And it's those experiences that keep inspiring Campbell.
It will make a difference on them, not just in maybe becoming a future member when they're an adult and they have kids of their own and they still remember this place 30 years from now, but because it might change how they view their town.
Our next story digs into a topic that is vitally important for many farmers when things don't go as planned.
So I'm thinking, and it sounds like we're talking about some kind of insurance.
That would be correct. In this case, it's crop insurance. Last year presented challenges for many farmers, especially those growing soybeans. Between a lack of rainfall and trade disputes with countries that purchase the crop, many farmers had to make insurance claims to break even on their investments.
What does that mean for farmers this year?
Well, that's what reporter Riley Hindle wanted to find out. She spoke with Ben Brown, an agriculture and business policy researcher at the University of Missouri Extension, to learn more about how crop insurance works as a risk management tool for farmers. Here's part of that conversation.
Thank you for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. What are some of the key things people need to understand about crop insurance?
Over the years, the crop insurance program has gone through a number of different iterations. Starting, about the 70s, we started to hear calls for the U.S. government to increase the amount of assistance that the federal government provided to insurance purchasers to help increase enrollment in the program. And there's been a number of different bills that have been passed over the last, let's just say, 5 decades that have slowly increased the amount of assistance the federal government provides to producers. The program itself has also transitioned away from just yield insurance policies to starting in the 1990s, revenue insurance started to be offered. This took into account both not just declines in yield, but also declines in price. So those were included. And then more recently, we've seen the involvement and even the interaction with margin-based programs. So not just output prices and yields, but also input prices is a part of that as well. And so it's gone through several iterations over time, but the bedrock of it is still to provide production risk management tools to producers.
Talk me through what was happening with crop insurance and what were the indemnity claims and all that in the 2024-2025 seasons, because anecdotally and through some reports I've heard that 2025 was a very rough year for farmers, especially Missouri soybean farmers.
The program exists to just help provide financial risk management tools and production risk management tools to producers. And 2025 in Missouri was a year where it didn't rain in August and September hardly at all across our state. Those are 2 key months for soybean development. So soybean yields, in some parts of the state were at average at best. For most of the state, quite a bit below average, and especially for late planted soybeans, yields were well below average. So, from a yield component, that was part of why we saw payments for crop insurance come to light. The second part of that is the price component. So, when we think about where we saw prices in March of February of last year compared to where they were in October, the price component also provided some opportunity for crop insurance payments as well. Just because we saw a lower price at harvest than what we saw back in the spring, and so that helped make payments and claims for producers as well.
In 2025, there was a lot of reports of farmers struggling, household farm income fluctuations. Mm-hmm. Is it possible we see a continuation of those troubles, or do we see things improving?
Yeah, so our forecast here at the University of Missouri and for our enterprise budgets would suggest that 2026 budgets, at least for the crop producers, are slightly better than they were in 2025, but still not covering total cost. And so what that means is that it's another year of declining working capital and declining finances on farms.
It doesn't sound like it's necessarily the crop insurance or the yield that's contributing to those declining revenues and not covering total costs. So what factors are?
the industry will continue to reward the low-cost producers. And unfortunately, the U.S. is just not a low-cost producer in many of our commodities. Other countries around the world can produce a crop and produce a product cheaper than we can. And so while we're getting the signal to reduce production and not plant as many acres here in the United States, other countries might be getting the signal to increase acres. People aren't, taking acres out of production to reduce their negative price pressure. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to provide government assistance, either through the form of higher crop insurance subsidies or as the one big beautiful bill did, which was increase payments, government payments to producers. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to try to provide federal assistance just to get us until we can find some way to get prices higher.
All right. Thank you, Ben. I appreciate you so much. Yep.
And now it's time for us to get into our words of the week. Trevor, what is your word this week?
So my word/double word this week is food truck.
Food truck. You have my attention. Please tell me more.
So I'm talking about food trucks that are going to be at the upcoming FIFA World Cup in Kansas City. A Missouri Senate committee heard a bill this week that would simplify food truck licensing by letting a truck with a county-issued license operate in any municipality in the county.
Okay, interesting. But that's not going to make the trucks less safe or regulated or anything, right?
Exactly. The bill specifies that no changes will be made to weaken health and sanitation regulations. Instead, it aims to create a more consistent and simplified licensing process for operators.
And how do the food truck operators feel about this?
Right now, it has a good chunk of support. One Kansas City food truck operator testified that the bill would remove redundancies in the current Jackson County application process.
So the hope with this bill is to have a lot more food truck activity when the World Cup rolls into town.
Exactly. And what is your word of the week?
My word, or double word this week, is glass floor.
And I'm assuming that might not be the opposite of the glass ceiling?
I hope not, because this floor is one that should not be shattered. Instead, I'm referring to the new digital floor screens being used in Big 12 basketball tournaments made by German company ASB Glass Floor.
Digital floor screens. I have never heard of those before.
I hadn't either until less than a week ago. The Big 12 tournament in Kansas City is one of the first use cases of U.S. competitions featuring the playing surfaces. It features digital graphics that can change throughout the game.
And it sounds like that might work for people watching on TV, but that could change what it's like to go to something like this in person, right?
Exactly, and that's kind of the intention, too. The plan is to include interactive fan games, animation, and increased advertising on the floor throughout the game. City tourism leaders are hoping that the digital floors will expand the traditional fan experience and therefore increase city revenues. And now it's time for our closing thought. For our closing thought, here's Chris Campbell of the Boone County History and Culture Center, speaking to the impact of community support and donations in keeping historical centers operational.
We're here because that funding from the state level is 3% or less of what we have. And that's only because we have so many donors and supporters that write checks. And as long as our community friends keep doing that, they can feel good that we'll still be here.
Well, that is all for this week. The M33 Project provided the music for this episode. For my co-host Trevor Grandin and editors Macklin Frazzini, Brianne Tremper, Kelly DeRook, and Michael Stacy, I'm Noah Grabianski, and this has been Business Brief. Thank you for listening.